In this video, I want to talk about the modern political spectrum. So we're going to talk about three political ideologies that together have dominated mainstream political discourse in most countries during the modern period. Um, so these ideas that we're going to talk about emerge in Europe in the 1800s following the massive changes brought about by the French Revolution, which lasted from 1789 to 1815, and the Industrial Revolution that took off in Britain around the same time period and that continued to pick up steam throughout the early and mid 1800s. So these two events basically totally shake up the political arrangements of Europe during this time period and bring about a new set of political ideas that have basically defined the political discourse ever since. And they're often considered to be on a spectrum. Uh, so on the right of the spectrum is conservatism, and then further to the left is liberalism, uh, and then to the far left is socialism. And there are other political ideologies that you could put on this spectrum, for example, like anarchism or fascism. But those ideas, even though they do play an important role in the political history of a lot of countries, are not the main popular ideologies that go on to become like ruling parties in most countries during the modern period. Conservatism, liberalism, and socialism are the dominant ideologies. And I wanted to talk about each one of them and also about their origins during the 1800s in post-revolution industrializing Europe. So let's start with conservatism. Conservatism is probably the easiest of these ideologies to understand. Basically, conservatives want to conserve what is good about the current system. Conservatives believe that the way things are is fine, uh, maybe even great. They believe that the current system exists for good reasons and that change is risky and possibly very dangerous. And therefore, they defend the way things are. And there are different degrees of conservatives. There are extreme conservatives, who are oftentimes called reactionaries, who actually want to push society back to an even earlier time that they feel they've strayed away from. Um, some conservatives want absolutely zero change and oppose all change at any point. A really good example of this in Europe is the Austrian foreign minister Clemens von Metternich, who opposes anything that looks like it might even hint towards any kind of liberal reform or revolution. Other types of conservatives are called moderate conservatives, and they accept that change is necessary. They just argue that we need to be very careful about change because society is complex and changes often have unintended consequences. So any change that we do implement should be incremental, reversible, and should respect the current institutions in place. And they believe that this is the only way to consistently change in a safe manner over time. Some people who represent this idea would include um, Edmund Burke, who was an Anglo-Irish member of Parliament, and who argued, among other things, that Britain should avoid heavily taxing America because it could lead to revolutionary activity in America. And he was right. Yeah, so anyway, that's conservatism. Things are good. We need to be careful about changing them. The next ideology, and one of the most powerful ideologies during the 1800s, is liberalism. In America, often called classical liberalism to distinguish it from liberalism in America today, which is, in many ways, not very liberal in the classical sense. So the liberals often were people who had not been treated fairly in the old aristocratic societies of Europe. These were people like highly educated doctors and lawyers, business owners, um, professors, people who, uh, other merchants or businessmen, people who had made a lot of money and made a big impact on society, but who lacked privilege in the old aristocratic orders. You know, they weren't counts or dukes; they were mere commoners. And then in the old systems, they had certain very important disadvantages. And so these people tended to support liberalism because it wanted to fix all of these problems and put in place a new fair system that would allow anybody to succeed who was willing to work hard and who had certain talents and whatnot. They thought that would be a very fair system. So liberals want to do three things. They want to eliminate irrational traditions. They want to establish a limited government that protects individual rights. And they want an economic system based on competitive markets. So let's go through those one at a time. I already mentioned that the old system in Europe was very unfair, at least in the eyes of liberals, and gave huge benefits to certain members of society for seemingly no reason. So like members of the nobility got all sorts of cool privileges and government powers simply because their ancestors had been knights or landowners. And a lot of times these nobles didn't even really do very much. They just hung out on huge estates and enjoyed privileges. Also, members of the church in a lot of European countries had huge benefits. And also in cities, guilds had formed little tiny monopolies that dominated various industries and made huge profits, even though they didn't use the most modern standard, the most modern modes of production. So all of these seem to make no sense to liberals. And so they wanted to get rid of these and replace them. And what they wanted was a government and an economy that gave equal opportunities to everybody and allowed those who had the best ideas to rise. And so in the government, what that would look like would be a government that plays a very limited role and whose main job is simply to protect the individual rights of people, and that would include life, liberty, and property. So the government would make sure nobody kills you. The government would make sure that you are not kidnapped. It would also promise not to arrest you for no reason, and it would make sure nobody steals your stuff. So liberals viewed that as the key purpose of the government. Economically, they believed that the best way to produce stuff was in a competitive market where lots of different people bought and sold lots of different things, and where no particular group had any special monopolistic advantage in producing certain goods. So if one person in town owns all the apple orchards, they're going to charge exorbitant prices. But if you're at an apple market where there's 100 different farmers all selling apples, they will have to compete with each other and they will lower their prices. Except maybe for the farmers who have figured out how to grow the best apples, and then they can charge slightly higher prices. So anyway, this economic system doesn't require a lot of government intervention. However, in order to ensure that the market operates properly, most liberals believed that it was okay for the government to regulate certain things. For example, preventing monopolies. Also, taking measures to ensure that goods and services could move freely around the country was another thing. So like helping to build roads or railroads or other types of infrastructure. Because when infrastructure is better, then markets function better because you can move stuff easily around to get the products to where they need to go. So that's liberalism. Eliminate irrational stuff that we used to do, introduce a limited government that protects rights and that ensures that a competitive market is the driving force for economic decision making. So that's liberalism. And liberalism in many countries catches on and becomes actually the dominant political ideology by 1900. And today, conservatives are actually classical liberals in many senses of the word. And that's because our global economic system is actually very much founded on classical liberal principles. So if you think the way things are now is good, you are a liberal because we have a largely liberal system, but You're also a conservative because you think that the way things are is good and we should be careful about changing it. So that's kind of why liberal and conservative have changed meanings over time. Anyway, the last major ideology that emerges during this time period is socialism. Socialism develops a little bit later than liberalism because it is reacting largely to the capitalist system, the industrial system that liberals helped to set up. Free market economics and limited government helps for the development of large industrial cities that employ hundreds of thousands of industrial workers who move to these new cities. And these workers have very hard lives. Not that they didn't have hard lives when they lived in the countryside. Being a peasant was definitely not great either. But now all of these poor workers are gathered together right next to each other. They can all talk to each other, and they can also see all the rich people who are making lots of money from their work. They can also talk to each other more easily than ever because they can all gather in bars or like tea houses, coffee shops, and they can read cheap newspapers that can be published for workers. So industrial workers for the first time can talk to each other. And it's among industrial workers that socialism gets its start. And basically, they hear all the liberals talk about equality and freedom and opportunity, but for them, all of that makes no sense. They are paid what is called a subsistence wage in most of the factories that they work in, which is enough to keep yourself alive and support a wife and maybe a kid. And you don't save any money. All of your money goes to food, rent, and clothes. And maybe you save up a little bit in case one of you gets sick. But the idea of accumulating wealth and rising up through society for these workers is absurd in almost all cases. And so they say that for a society to really be equal and for people really to be free, the system has to be set up in such a way that everybody has an equal shot to live a decent life, and that everybody should have certain basic goods provided for them. And some of the main ones that socialists call for, and there are lots of different types of socialists, but some of the main ones that most socialist political parties call for is universal free education. They also call for some kind of assurance of economic security. This could come from some sort of guaranteed employment, or maybe from government-provided like help in seeking out employment or something like that. Or, if nothing else, just economic support if you happen to be unemployed to keep you from starving. And last of all, socialists demand political power for poor people. Most liberals during this time period were not Democrats. The earliest liberals believed that voting rights should be based on property. And they believed that if you let poor people vote, the first thing that poor people would vote for would be to take away property from rich people. And in many ways, these fears were right. A lot of socialists called for the confiscation of the property of the wealthy, or if not that, at least serious redistribution of that property to poorer people. And so the socialists were actually the first people to call for mass political involvement. They were the first real Democrats who called for universal manhood suffrage, at least in Europe. In the United States, the tradition is slightly different, and universal manhood suffrage comes about a little earlier without any of these socialist tinges. But in Europe, democracy and socialism are allied for a long time. So anyway, that's the political spectrum. Conservatives think the way things are right now is fine. Liberals want to get rid of a lot of traditions and replace them with limited government and the free market. And socialists believe that limited government and the free market simply create a new unfair system that gives huge privileges to different groups of people, but still exclude a large portion of the population who are poor workers. And they think that the government needs to do more to ensure that everybody in society has a decent life and an opportunity for achievement and growth. So that is the basic political spectrum. And you need to have a framework of those basic ideas if you're going to go into any sort of deeper analysis of the history of political thought. So there you go.